Right. Hello, everyone. Sarah Bloom with Downtown Hayes Development Corporation in Hayes, Kansas, also a ITGA board member. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a few minutes to get everyone in the room, and we are actually going to make all of the attendees panelists today, so you have the option of turning your video on. We encourage you to do that. That way you can interact with us and ask questions throughout. I also have a favor to ask. If you attended the webinar in June, where we had several presenters talking about lots of different tools to engage with town gown partnerships or to measure those partnerships, go ahead and put that in the chat for us. Let us know if you were here in June or if this is the first time that you are getting to hear about Collaboratory. And we're going to take a few minutes to make sure everyone gets turned over to panelists. So as soon as there's no attendees, I will invite our wonderful panelists to get started. Thank you, Diane. Watching the chat. Again, looking at the chat, let us know if you were here in June or if this is your first one. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Lawrence. This is going to help our presenters or our panelists know what to talk about today. So again, in the chat, let us know if you attended in June or if this is your first time hearing about Collaboratory. Again, my name is Sarah Bloom. I'm an ITGA board member, and I get the extreme honor of moderating the Town Gown Turnaround series. Great, thank you, Bob. Glad you're back. Hi, Poppy. Thank you, Lisa. Kristin, it looks like the majority are hearing this for the first time with a few attendees in June so far.
I can work with that. My goal is to not bore anyone.
Hello, Sharon, welcome back. We're still getting a few more people turned over to panelists rather than attendees. We want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to turn their video on and interact as much as you would like to. That is the fun thing about Town Gown Turnaround. It's all about networking and seeing each other's faces and connecting with people across the globe. Thanks, Janet. Okay, it looks like we are good to go. So without further ado, we'll get started. Again, Sarah Bloom, ITGA board member, very excited to get to moderate these Town Gown Turnaround series. If you were here in June, we are continuing a discussion on how to measure town gown partnerships. In June, we had several groups talking about 3 different tools that they use or have created to do just that. And now we are diving in deeper. What's really exciting about that is this is because of a Town Gown Turnaround networking session where we had the question asked, how do you do this? And so this is a result of that networking, and it's ITGA answering that question and really giving you, our ITGA members, what you're looking for, what you're asking for. And so I am actually not moderating today. I am just introducing the session so that you know this is an ITGA webinar as well as a part of the Town Gown Turnaround series. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to Kristin Medlin, who you have already seen. I'm sorry, I got the wrong Kristin. Kristin Norris. Kristin Medlin's at the top of my screen. Kristin Norris, who was a panelist during our June webinar and who will be moderating today to dig further in to the tool known as Collaboratory. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, panelists especially, for your time leading up to this and for today. Kristin, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah, and the rest of the Beth and everybody from ITGA for inviting us and helping us to actually think about this together. One of the reasons that I've invited my colleagues to join me here today to do a deeper dive into Collaboratory is because I have the great pleasure and benefit of working with them and thinking alongside them, because all of our all of us are using Collaboratory. We all sort of have a shared understanding of what is our shared goals and what we're trying to achieve. Now we may be implementing Collaboratory a little bit differently or taking a different approach to how we get information populated into our portals, or we might be using the data differently. But in general, we actually all have the benefit of learning from each other. So Collaboratory sort of sets up what I would consider a community of practice amongst all of their institutions. And so I invited a couple of them today to talk about how a variety of us are using it. My goal for my intro portion of this, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the stuff I went through in our June webinar, just to make sure that those who weren't here in June are caught up on what the heck Collaboratory really is. We originally started this conversation with understanding what are we trying to measure and why. And my colleague, actually Emily Anke on here, and Barbara Holland published an article called Data Matters not that long ago and goes through the top 10 reasons. And I say systematically, I'm going to emphasize that word, systematically collecting information. I've been at IU for 14 years, and in the 14 years that I've been there, we've been using Collaboratory for the last 4, but prior to that, I've been through 3 different processes for which we use to capture and track partnerships. We were mostly in the habit of counting things, counting courses, counting students, counting hours, and not really understanding the impact of our partnerships or the work or the extent to which our institution was working to address community identified needs. That has shifted, and trying to make sure that the university shifts our processes and does it in a systematic way has been extremely important to us. I will also articulate, and I use this sort of an interesting who does what, where, with whom, and for what purpose language a lot in our dialogue around Collaboratory. The right-hand side of the screen that you see is what I think most institutions have: systems and processes for systematically capturing information. We capture things within courses and projects and research studies, and we have systems such as grants databases, and we have faculty HR systems, and we have student information systems. We have a registrar keeps a database of things, right? We have lots of tools and processes that live on the right-hand side. However, institutions of higher education rarely have very good systems for capturing the things on the left-hand side, much less how the things on the left are related to the things on the right in any comprehensive or systematic way. When I start to add things to this, sometimes we have institutions who are good at tracking. I would say this black line is the most common process that we see at institutions, that we capture courses and we figure out which community partners do faculty who teach those courses work with. We also might do some of this in the co-curricular. But if I were to draw all of these lines, what I'm suggesting is, and I could draw even more, that we really need all of those, that we need to understand how faculty, staff, and students are working in and with our communities, and what are these relationships, and what does it look like when we work together. Somebody always asks me, so what does Collaboratory really capture? And I somewhat jokingly throw this slide up. If you can identify, at the end of the day, if you can name an organization, a population, a community partner, an agency, an organization, or an individual, and your work with them is contributing to the greater good of society. At our institution, we strive to track it in a systematic way. That is very different than something like, oh, are you counting courses? There are other tools out there that our colleagues use, such as GivePulse, which is about student volunteer hours, and course-based experiences. It's really capturing one very niche type of experience. That's not what we're talking about here. So we can think about faculty who do 4-year projects with the state, or a one-off event. This can include also public service types of things. We have faculty members in museum studies, for example, who do exhibits or displays that examine race relations in our community. That is 100% something that we can put into Collaboratory, especially depending on how they partnered with neighborhood residents to tell their story of growing up in this community and how gentrification or other types of issues have contributed to where we are today. I also, during our June webinar, tried to highlight a little bit of the ways in which IUPUI has been using this. We use it to map our engagement, to both identify where we are, but also where we are not. Telling stories. We have recently applied for the Times Higher Education, or the Times Higher Ed Impact Rankings, and IUPUI was well ranked, I would say. So this is Sustainable Development Goals, something we're very proud of. By the way, those of you who are unfamiliar with the SDGs, genuinely partnerships is a foundational requirement of all of the institutions who apply for those. I have a way of using this to acknowledge the faculty and staff at our campus who do community engaged work and public service. We think about ways of convening people and creating new networks and demonstrating our impacts. I have 4 slides that correspond to this, but those of you who are in June probably have already seen a lot of this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, and I would like to let our panelists discuss what they're doing. This is a map of our engagement. We overlay it with publicly available data. So if you want to know what are we doing to address K through 12 education, I can overlay that with what percentage of students in our area have a high school graduation, or high school diploma, sorry, graduated high school. And the blue dots are where we have community engaged activities. The green dots are where we have assets in the community, but we do not necessarily have a partnership with them, such as a library or another nonprofit organization that supports K-12. We shared some new, we use Arcgis to do some storytelling. These links are on our website and you can scroll down. We use Collaboratory, multiple sources of media and photos to begin to tell a better narrative of our engagement using story mapping processes. We have a faculty directory that, as you can see, if you click on their profiles, it links to that. So Peter Altenberger, if you click on that, you can see all of his projects, all of his community partners, and a description of what he's doing. We also updated this to include our ScholarWorks. ScholarWorks for us is our research office's database for tracking faculty do certain types of research. So you'll see an update on our website. But every faculty member and staff member, by the way, as a staff member for many years that does community engaged work sometimes, often gets missed in the narrative because we don't ask staff what they're doing in and with their communities. Every faculty and staff member that has an activity in IUPUI's portal of Collaboratory has a profile on our website. And we have an entire web page that I won't go through, but this infographic here is using Collaboratory data to understand how many community partners, what percentage of our activities happen within our county of Marion County, and we have a donut surrounding of 9 counties, and how many students we were able to connect with because of our engagement. So I think that it's most important for you to understand really how Collaboratory works for those of you who weren't there. This is an example of our portal. It is a highly relational, publicly searchable database of tracking who does what. You can search it by African Americans and STEM education, and you'd see every project, every faculty member, every unit. The key piece of the distinctive difference between Collaboratory and other tracking systems at our institution is that the activity is the unit of analysis. That is different than in, for example, your student information system, where the student ID number is the unit of analysis, or in IRB, you get randomly assigned an IRB number. You have a grant, you have an account number that your fiscal officer manages. In Collaboratory, when I name an activity, that becomes the central unit of analysis. Notice it's not the course and it's not the community partner, which has historically been the unit of analysis for prior to us using Collaboratory. But by making the activity the central unit of analysis, we are then able to tag, if it's connected to coursework, which courses, what were the learning outcomes, and which high impact practices were used. If it's connected to community partners, what are the units on campus that are connected? So what are the centers, offices, schools, departments, institutes, what community organizations, which faculty and staff, and in instances where we're working with, for example, the community college, what other institutions of higher education are there? We track funding, both internal and external to the institution. The issue areas in the population, the location, all of these things are sort of fields that exist within Collaboratory that were difficult, are oftentimes left, that information is in aggregate disparate pay spaces in our institution. So I've given examples on the square, and the squares are examples of places where I follow breadcrumbs. But when I put it into Collaboratory, I am tagging those activities that we are doing by what social issues they're working to address, what populations they're serving, and clarify who the partners are. And so I'm better able to sort of pull it all together. So in Collaboratory, there's a proxy feature. So faculty and staff can add their own activities, but the best beauty of it is I have work study students, 3 of them, who work about 10 to 15 hours a week in my office. And we sort of comb newsletters. We sit down and have coffee with faculty members. We learn about the 4 projects that we're doing. Then we go and populate it in Collaboratory on their behalf. And if there is information in their annual report or in the contracts and grants office that we're able to glean from, my students are then able to do some of the research and follow up. By the way, my students are learning a lot that they would never have learned otherwise. And if I could do a whole new session on like the impact of Collaboratory on our students learning about and loyalty to the institution and an appreciation for what community engagement means in higher ed. That was a lot for me to say. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now actually and let Ellen start sharing hers. And while she's getting her screen set up, I'm going to then pause for a second and say, if you have questions about what Collaboratory is, I can answer those at any point in time during the chat or whatever. But I wanted you to now know what it is and then how are other people actually using it to understand their partnerships. So I've invited some wonderful colleagues. I'm going to start with Ellen. Ellen is a colleague of mine from University of IU Northwest up in the northern part of Indiana. She's a professor, but also the director of our Center for Urban and Regional Excellence. So she does a lot of partnership work. And I want her to talk a little bit about how she's used Collaboratory to think about her relationships, both implement it as a faculty development tool, but then also how she's used it to foster community conversations. So Ellen, are you okay if I turn it over to you and let you work your magic?
Good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be here to share with you our campus's experience with using Collaboratory and speak to the shared understanding that we have with the other institutions, as Kristin was saying, that we're all interested in understanding how it is that we're working in and with the community. And so I want to give you a little bit of backstory first so that you can understand our context, and then briefly summarize for you the approach that we took by asking a couple of questions. How can we support our community engagement? Where are we? And then how do we then advance this information and leverage Collaboratory so that we can actually affect culture change on our campus? And so I'm going to stop the share here right now. So a little bit of background. We have a fascinating region that we work in here in the metropolitan region of Chicago. We're located in Northwest Indiana. We are a regional commuter campus. We serve approximately 3,800 students, 350 of which are graduate students that pursue degrees in a variety of areas, including public administration, education, clinical psychology, et cetera. So we are really a fixture in our community, an anchor in our community that has had a long tradition of being engaged, but we have also struggled with trying to define just what that means for our campus. And so coming up with a model for community engagement for our campuses, many campuses have throughout the country. So over the course of the last 7 years, community engagement actually became one of our strategic priorities. And as a result of that, we started a process of reflection, thinking about, okay, what does it mean for us to work in and with the community? How are we connected? Why are we connected? And then what will community engagement look like in 5 to 10 years? And so that's where we were in our thought process when we were able to join the Collaboratory community. And when we joined the Collaboratory community, we saw this as an opportunity really to one step toward operationalizing our strategic priority of community engagement. And so our initial goal was to collect information, track and report, which obviously is a tremendous asset for us, and figure out just where it is that we are with respect to our existing initiatives. We needed an inventory for the purpose of strategic planning, and we also wanted to be able to enhance our leadership's efforts to tell our story with our community partners, our funders, and education leaders throughout the state. So we we embraced Collaboratory as a tool for us for tracking and reporting. And in the course of this, we learned a great deal about what its power was for us in this context to actually go a little bit deeper. And for us, where we were in our context, we need to go a little bit deeper and think about, so what will this, how could this tool be used for us to connect to our faculty, to connect to our staff, to connect to students and community in different ways? And so I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some of the ways that we have done this, and I'm happy to discuss it a little bit more when we have our panel discussion. So our first strategic step was to think about listening to all of the stakeholder groups that would be featured in Collaboratory. So we knew that we would have student activities, as I said, faculty, staff, and community partners in Collaboratory, but we hadn't had the opportunity to listen to those partners in a way that would provide us with some guidance in informing our strategic priorities. So what did we do? With our community partners, we had information sharing sessions and community conversations. We asked them to provide their thinking on how Collaboratory could be a tool for them as community partners to better engage with each other, but also with the university. We also wanted to assess their perceptions of the university with the work that we were already doing. So when we had those activities inside of Collaboratory and we shared that with the community, we said, is this how you perceive our campus? And if not, can you explain to us what you are thinking and how it is that we can better share this information that we're working on sharing with you? And so these reflections led us to some intentional work with respect to opportunities for deepening that conversation with our community partners. And I'll share that in a second. With faculty, we had individual conversations with our champions that we had identified in advance. And that then led us to the conclusion that we really had opportunities to have deep conversations with our faculty about what they think community engagement is. You know, how do they distinguish community engagement from service? And what are the barriers to them participating more actively in community-based activities, and what support do they need? And with students, we had a fellowship program that did something similar. So I'm going to in the interest of time here, I'm just going to share two ways in which we leverage that learning. One is that we had not had a previous newsletter for our campus and community. We created a newsletter, and one of the features in the newsletter is the work that is being featured in Collaboratory. So now we are providing the faculty with and students and staff with an opportunity to showcase their work in a newsletter that goes out to about 500 community members right now, and of course our campus. And then most recently, we developed a Partners in Conversation. This Partners in Conversation series is a conversation between a community partner and a faculty, staff, or student member who are working on issues together. We designed this conversation to be a very short conversation that is featured on YouTube, and we'll also have some live opportunities as well. We wanted to highlight existing initiatives, provide examples of and model how we can have those collaborative conversations, sharing community expertise and university expertise. And then also break down some of those barriers and dispel perceptions that the university is the expert and has all of the resources. So those are two ways that we used, built on the work through Collaboratory in order to build our work in the community with and in the community so that we could have the ultimate, we can build capacity so that we can navigate this process a little bit easier. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. I think what's been interesting in Ellen's experience, there was a question posed to me privately that I'm going to address publicly. To the part of this has to do with implementation strategy. So some people think there's a ton of effort that goes into creating your portal, and yes, you have to bulk import courses, and we import our community partners. And keep in mind, it's an org chart inside of Collaboratory, so you do need to tell them that this center or institute reports to this school or college of whatever, so that when you run a report for a dean, a vice president, a president, or a chancellor, that you are capturing the activities that are connected to their unit on campus. So it's, yeah, so you have to set it up properly, I guess, is some setup process. But Ellen's approach has been very much a way of thinking of faculty development, asking faculty, what does this mean to you? That is very different than a survey that an institution may send out asking them to tell me about your high impact practice courses or whatever it is that you've done in the past. However, did you call them service learning? Did you call them community engaged learning? Did you call it whatever you called it? That terminology raises questions for faculty, whereas Ellen's approach was, let me have a dialogue with faculty about what this means to them. And based on what they say, we can help guide them to make sure that the institution values, that it's capturing it in a way that honors and values the way the faculty member sees their work. Some of you have asked if it's connected to other databases, and there is no correct API that directly imports stuff into Collaboratory. And there's a really strong reason for that. Everything you ask faculty to report on is an output that you force them to do inside of buckets called teaching, research, and service, maybe broadly in other. We have 13 buckets, but they all fall into those 3 categories. If a faculty member is doing this work, we see it being integrated to that. So faculty members' service to an organization on a board is captured somewhere else, but that's not what gets put into Collaboratory. It's the project that they did as part of their role on that board is what Collaboratory captures. And if they involve their students as part of that project, we know whether or not it was connected to which course or which co-curricular type of thing that their students, was it a work study student or an intern? If it's connected to the faculty member's research, we capture whether it is connected and what the outputs are, and probably in ways that we honor more so than what the university says they value. So we care about more than just high impact journals that get rated there. We look at white papers. Did you develop a database? Did you create a new thing for them? And what is that thing? And so for us, that's one activity in Collaboratory, but that description I just gave you would appear in 3 buckets of somebody's a faculty member's annual report. And so we use the in reports and comb through them to follow the breadcrumbs and know that we need to have a conversation with that faculty member, but we're not dictating what they call it, how they call it, and how they describe it, forcing them to put it into buckets, because most of the faculty members don't think about this work in buckets and silos either. So Ellen had that sort of approach to and a faculty development mindset. IUPUI launched this. We asked every dean to identify what we call a data liaison. I have a point person who's fairly usually someone who's in the know in a campus unit, and we work together to figure out what's the best way to capture what your school or your center, your institute's doing. Most of them had examples of things or things they could share, and we started by populating Collaboratory with what they already knew was happening. And then we created a conversation in their unit, said, hey, here's what we know is going on. Tell us what's missing. And then we go back every year to those units and say, hey, is this still working? Are you still doing this project? Is this still relevant? Tell us what else we're missing. And so it becomes a cyclical thing. It's not a survey at one point in time, like a faculty annual report. And if I see a press release today that comes out that we're doing something, I add it in the moment so that we all know in the moment what's going on. We try to keep it as most up to date as possible. Have we noticed any types of faculty? So yeah, there was a question in the Q&A that I'll address really quickly too. I think that the answer is yes. So in my history of tracking community engaged and counting courses, I did it for 7 years, the fabulous 5 members. One of the last things when we talk to a faculty member about their engagement is, can you tell me somebody else on campus that is also doing this? And I thought I was like, we had a fairly strong distribution list. When we launched Collaboratory, we sent it to the people that we knew that did this work. And the people now represented in Collaboratory just didn't call it that. Their discipline, for example, the STEM fields don't necessarily call it community engagement, or community engagement looks and feels very different in those fields than it does in others. Other things that we were missing that people were just annoyed with telling us. We have certain faculty who are working with 30 community partners, but just didn't want to fill out the dang survey and list all 30 partners. And so they've never been captured because they're annoyed. So we stopped annoying people and we did the work for them. And we actually have a much more robust list of things. We've also got a lot of stuff that we thought was just volunteerism, and we missed a ton of research was happening at our institution that was deeply community engaged research, deeply rooted in partnerships, but because we would have always been just focused so heavily on the curricular and student engagement portion of that, which was the impetus for us thinking about this, we were missing a whole group of faculty members who were great partners in our work and thinking about what is the institution working towards addressing in our community? Where do we have resources? Where do we have assets? Where do we have expertise? And I love our research office, but there was no way they were ever, unless the community partner was paying for it, it had not been captured. And so all of the other stuff that didn't have a money trail behind it was never being documented at the institution. I hope I've answered, please keep sending questions to me about how it works in the chat and other things, and I will stop trying to interrupt the time to allow my colleagues to move on. I'm going to shift it over to Matt. Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself and sort of where you came about this, but I learned of Matt because he was a scholar at Collaboratory when he used to be at University of Washington, Tacoma. And we were great thought partners in thinking about the strength of relationships. It's like, I had a hypothesis. I was like, does the length of a partnership mean it's a stronger partnership? If students are involved, does that mean we have a stronger partnership? So Matt and I got to like have really great conversations about thinking of that. And I want to give him a second to sort of talk about his role at Collaboratory for 2 seconds if you want, but then also share with us what you've been thinking about with that process.
I would be happy to. Kristin, do you have my slides or do you want me to share them? Sorry, you're muted.
I can share them for you if you would like.
That would be lovely, thank you. Hey, so yeah, thanks Kristin for having me today. Like Kristin was saying, my name is Matt. Currently, I'm the data analytics and BI specialist at Collaboratory. And what I wanted to talk about today was some work that Kristin Medlin and I did last winter with the national Collaboratory data set. And we really kind of wanted to start exploring what kinds of things and what kinds of trends can we start teasing out of this national data. This work took place over about 6 months. It was when I was working with the University of Washington, Tacoma. I was with their Office of Community Partnerships. But at the time, I was also a Collaboratory Research Fellow. And that was a 6-month term where we just started kind of exploring the different types of things that we can tease from this data. So our research question at the beginning was, we have this Collaboratory data set. Can we start to identify what the strongest relationships are in this data? This is an abbreviated version of a presentation I gave a couple months ago. There is a recording of that if anyone wants it, and I'd be happy to kind of answer questions later on too. So a brief intro to Collaboratory data. I assume most people haven't seen it before, and like Kristin was saying, it's great for saying, you know, those top 5 numbers, you know, how many people are we addressing, who are we working with? But it's also like much more robust than that. It has details about where activities are taking place, activities that vary in size and scope, things like small guest speaking events, or multi-year publicly funded research initiatives. There's lots of different types of activities in Collaboratory. We have timelines, we have expected, we have achieved outcomes, students, faculty, and staff involvement, what kinds of issues, and lots more data points. So we took a look at these data fields and we started trying to pull out which do we think would be usable for our assessment of what we were calling relationship strength. We took a survey of existing Collaboratory administrators, some IR teams, and some other leadership teams, and we compiled a list of categories in the data that we thought might help us to identify which the stronger relationships were in the data set. And those proxy fields became, like Kristin was saying, the length of time that a partner and a university have worked together. We assume that if you've been working together for a longer amount of time, we can say that you might have a stronger relationship. Secondly, we said, how many times does a partner appear in a Collaboratory's portal? And the assumption is that if you appear, you know, multiple times, we can say that maybe we have a stronger relationship. And then lastly, we looked at the funding received between a partner and a university for their different activities. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. There's some other fields that we identified as proxies, and then through part of our research, we decided to either include or exclude them from our research. But for kind of our initial stab, we took these three proxy fields. So the first is the length of time a partner was engaged in with a university. So what we did was to calculate the total duration of activities in days, and that's on the left-hand side. So it looks something like this. We can see there's a large number of activities that lasted 1 month or less, and then roughly a flat distribution of activities up to about 1,200 days, or like 3.5 years. And the average duration was about 600 days. The problem with this, though, is that this only accounts for activities as a one-off. And what we wanted to calculate was the sum of the duration of all activities. So for example, if a local hospital is working on 3 different activities, I want the cumulative amount of time that the university and the partners have been engaged. So we do a little bit of math, and the distribution comes out a little bit differently, and that's on the right-hand side. So we see there continues to be that spike of short-term activities, 1 month or less. And then we definitely see a little bit more of a curve forming right around that 1,000 days mark. So it's just a little bit shy of 3 years. So now we have this distribution. We say, okay, we're going to assign a cutoff for what qualifies as a long duration partnership. We chose that cutoff to be 1,673 days. And we calculated that using the mean plus 1 standard deviation. So when we apply it to our data, there are 738 activities in the national data set that meet the criteria of long duration. Next slide, please. Next, we want to do the same type of analysis, but we want to do it on the number of times a partner and a university are engaged. So again, dilemma was that the more activities in the data set might be an indicator of a stronger mutual trust and willingness to work together. So we summarized the data and we found the number of activities per relationship. And this was a little bit surprising. What we found was that the majority of relationships in the data set were single activity. Roughly 61% of them came out to be one activity only. So for the purposes of our research, then we said for our cutoff value, we say, okay, any university and partner relationship that has more than one activity, we'll consider those to be high frequency. So of all the relationships then in the Collaboratory National Data Set, roughly 1,500 of them come out to be high frequency. And then next slide. Finally, we take a look at the funding amount. And our assumption is that strong relationships are supported with funding, either externally or internally, but the relationship is nurtured by that funding. While we were taking a look and investigating the funding, we just kind of pulled some simple statistics about funding in the data set, and there was some really impressive results in there. There were 460 partnerships in the national data set that listed at least one funder. The average value, the mean value, was almost $600,000 per activity. And there was one activity in the Collaboratory that was listed as having over $12 million in funding. And in total, $275 million of funding was listed in Collaboratory, which I think is a very impressive dollar value and kind of goes to show that there's a lot of engaged, funded research happening in collaboratory institutions. So finally, we put it all together. So we have these 3 proxies, and remember our initial goal was to set out to try and find relationships in the database that we might be considered to be strong. Through our kind of high level look at these proxy fields, a strong relationship then becomes defined as anything that has a cumulative duration of longer than 1,600 days, any relationships where there's more than one listed activity in Collaboratory, and any relationship that's listed as having a funder for any dollar amount. And then when we apply these criteria back to our data, we discover there's 104 partnerships that fit the bill for that. So this was our first kind of run at analyzing this national data set, and it kind of leads us to a number of great next steps. I want to note that this does not initially mean that all of those 104 relationships are strong, but rather they fit the criteria for what we might consider to be strong. So the logical next step then becomes investigating qualitatively these relationships to determine if our assessment methodology was correct. Additionally, there was like I said at the beginning, there were other proxy values in the data that we initially thought might be useful. that started begging further questions. So all of this kind of leads to say that the collaboratory data set is very big and very robust, and it has opened up a lot of really fun and exciting research questions for us. And I'm really excited to continue to work on those. And specifically, thank you to Kristin for putting this together, for bringing me onto the panel today. I'm happy to answer any questions about it during our time later. And I have the scripts for the research we did, and additionally, I have the full form video of this presentation if anyone would like it.
I can't figure out, can you still see my screen? I can't figure out how to stop.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kristin, sorry, then it paused for a second. Hopefully, Kristin Medlin, you can share your screen and I don't have to touch anything because I can't find the
Poor thing. Okay, does everybody see that?
Can you guys hear me
Yes.
now? My screen
Yes.
froze.
All right. Well, Kristin, I guess this means that Emily and I are up next, so we can take it away from here.
That's good. Chris, is
Yeah.
our first slide, Kristin?
Yes, go for
Okay.
it. And if you want to introduce yourself too, because I think
Sure.
Kristin's having technical difficulties.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Hi, I'm Emily Yankee. I am the director of the Institute for Community and Economic Engagement at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. My institute, the institute that I direct, I should say, is in the Office of Research and Engagement. So I report to our Chief Research Officer. And I have been working in this position and in that research office for the last 10 years, and I've been at UNCG for 13. And in all that work, I've worked with faculty and staff and students around service learning, and then also now in the Institute, really focused on scholarship and research in lots of ways that were connected to our communities directly. And so in that role, I've worked with Kristin Medlin for almost a decade before she moved over to Collaboratory. And so a lot of the work that we're talking about is sort of why we came up in the beginning with needing Collaboratory. Because and the short is that we needed to make our lives easier. We are responsible often for communicating to many different audiences. And we know that good communication means that you understand what your audience wants to know about, and that you have data or information or stories that are meaningful to them. And so at UNCG, we knew that there were a great number of faculty and staff and students who are engaged in our communities. That's why I came to UNCG. That's why I've stayed here and made it a home for myself and my family and part of my career. And so one of the keys to this is that we needed an asset-based approach to be able to tell our story about how we were aligning our priorities. UNCG was aligning its priorities with the community. And so we needed a better way of capturing that information from faculty and staff that was really telling, again, meaningful information. So Kristin Norris talked about activity level data. Previously, we just could say we have this number of service learning classes, or something like that, or number of hours. But when we were talking with the university advancement, when we were talking about communities, our legislature, it was harder for us to come up with those stories. And often they wanted to know geography. Can you tell us what you're doing in the 100 counties of North Carolina? Can you tell us what you're doing on a specific topic? Of course, that happens if you work in universities or in government. You know that that request comes in Friday at 3, and they'd like to have that for a meeting on Monday or Tuesday, right? So that's just, we learned that that is a pattern that we can expect. And so predicting future behavior based on past behavior, we decided that we needed something like Collaboratory. So this is an image of a report that we have generated that looks at university and talks about a story about UNCG's engagement as it's connected to our strategic plan, our research, our teaching, our service, how it transforms knowledge, students, and our region as focus areas. One of the key things before we'll move to the next slide is that we really needed to be able to, we wanted to go from individual to collective. So this idea that in community engagement and in academia more generally, faculty have autonomy. And so we often get to choose who our community partners are, what kind of research projects we want to work on with them, if we and when we integrate service learning into our courses. And so that's great, but we also wanted to be able to be accountable to those faculty as well as to community partners and students, and to be able to understand how we can support those individuals who may feel like, hey, I've been doing this on my own. How is UNCG helping me do this work? And so that was important for us to be able to move from this idea of individual interactions to really a collective agenda. So the next slide. So part of the work that we've been talking about is looking, and so what I'm going to talk about is not about UNCG's case study, because that's already been presented in a wonderful way previously. But we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of place marking. So you may be familiar with benchmarking. Benchmarking is essentially something that started in the 90s in industry, where folks were really focused on quality improvement and how do we use benchmarks or measures to be able to assess where we are today and be able to make plans for the future and some goals. It was also used as a strategy to identify peers. And so who are those peer institutions that are like us, so we can gauge ourselves across many different metrics. And then how do we also find peers who are aspirational peers that we're like close enough to, that we can imagine that we could become them if only we did blank. And so place marking is really riffing on this idea of benchmarking and building upon it with this idea that if we are excellent in community engagement, if we really care about place mattering of where we are, then not only do we need to identify who our peers are and our metrics in terms of thinking about progress towards future goals, according to our own institutional characteristics, but we also want to be looking at the community context as well as our own institutional activity. And one last part is that for benchmarking, it's really about not about the metric. It's really about understanding how people got to, or what the process was to get to that metric. So then I can get in touch with that other institution, that other peer institution, and say, hey, how are you doing this awesome thing? Can you tell me more about this particular outcome that you're getting? So it's not just about meeting a rank or a score. The real value and the real impetus for it was continuing to improve quality. And to do that, we have to understand process. Next slide. So there's a triangle, there's 3 elements. The first is institutional characteristics. These are the typical metrics that are used to identify peers. And so it often looks at what they call IPEDS data. So looking at enrollments, program completion, graduation rates, the number of faculty and staff, the type of finances, how much money, what the budget is, external funding that has been recruited, student financial aid. So these are things that are collected across all institutions by an independent organization that is pretty easy to go find and collect. Next slide. The second, and I'm going to move through these quickly because then Kristin Medlin's going to do an application. The community characteristics is the second of those 3. And that's, we're looking at opportunity index. And so this is an index, again, that's collected by by an organization that's interested in understanding how do we improve quality of life and well-being in different communities. And so in that way, we have a screenshot of just some of the data that is there. But it really is looking at economy, education, community, and health. And so we've found that this has been really helpful to understand what our institution looks like in terms of when we're starting to look for peers, to be able to understand like whose best practices can we go steal, right? Who's doing a really good job in this place? Or how, if at all, is the peer that's been selected for our institution like us or not like us? Are they in a community that's wildly different with regards to opportunity indexes? And the third one is the institutional activity. And this is where the collaboratory comes in, because this is data that our institutions have to collect themselves, because this is something that hasn't previously been collected for us, or even in a lot of our faculty annual reporting or our staff reporting measures. And so I'm not going to spend too much time here because Matt and others have talked a little bit about what Collaboratory collects, but you'll see these bullet points. It talks, it's really about the who, what, where, when, why, to what ends of that activity for that community engagement. And so if we have these three pieces, part of a place marking theory is saying that we can do better by our institutions as being community engaged. We can do better by our institutions as well as communities and our community engagement by having a fuller picture of the landscape in which we're operating and the way that we're doing it. So I'll turn it over to Kristin Medlin, who again has been at UNCG, but now is at Collaboratory and is running the show there.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
So I'll just introduce myself really quickly. I'm Kristin Medlin. I'm Collaboratory's Director of Research and Development and have run pretty much every role that you could think of in the corporate world for Collaboratory. Emily also failed to mention that so Emily, myself, and then Barbara Holland are co-founders of Collaboratory. It originated back at UNC Greensboro in like 2010, maybe, and then made the jump to the corporate sector in 2014 because we realized that managing a tool like this was not what institutions like to wake up every day doing and investing in. So in 2014, I made the jump from academia into the private sector. And as they say, the rest is history. But I'm really excited because we're at the point where we have enough institutions using Collaboratory that we can begin to look at bigger data. It's by no means big data if you think about the definition of that word in the tech field, but we have almost 50 institutions worth of data. We have over 3,000 activities. We have over 10,000 data points on the role of the community partner. So we have a lot of data that we feel a great responsibility to share and to leverage for institutional improvement and insights. And so we're working to make a lot of that data available for researchers to use. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But this place marking idea that Emily and Kristin Norris and I have been kind of chewing on for the last year or so really only became possible to do, to really look at in the last 6 months maybe, because we had enough institutional data that we could start to look across our models. So this is just one application. Matt's project was another one. We have some folks who are thinking about like the sustainable development goals and how those map into Collaboratory. So the potential for new and interesting projects from a research perspective is huge. So if that's something that interests you, please feel free to reach out. We're really committed to changing the field and providing a resource for the field. Technology just happens to be the vehicle that we can do it through and the thing that we can provide. So to come back to this place marking project, the three of us sat down and started out by looking at UNCG's traditional institutional peers. And so if you look at this list, these peers were selected through processes that every institution goes through. So there's not a standard peer identification process. They typically look through like IPEDS characteristics. So that third party that collects the data that Emily was mentioning is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, hosted by the National Education Statistics Center, I think. And so if your institution gets federal funding for financial aid for students, your institution's data is in IPEDS. And so they use that to try to identify like peers based on similarities between certain characteristics. And then oftentimes there's kind of an expert review. So there's like a blended process of let's do a cluster analysis, but let's also do ask people that are knowledgeable in this to see if what they think and who they think our peers should be. And so UNCG's peers may not look like IUPUI's peers and vice versa, just in terms of the process that they go through to identify them. So, you look at these peers. I don't know if you're surprised by this or not. There were a few on this list that I was like, oh, okay. And this list was updated in 2020. So this list previously, like IUPUI, used to be identified as a peer institution of UNCGs. They are not anymore, based on institutional characteristics. So what we did is we took those institutional peers, the traditionally identified peers, and we looked up the opportunity index statistics for those. So the opportunity index has socioeconomic and demographic indicators across education, economy, community, and health, and they aggregate up. So there's individual metrics that get aggregated into that single opportunity score that then get a letter grade assigned to them. So it actually makes it probably oversimplifies it, but for our purposes where we need like a national data set that has comprehensive data across every county, I think the Opportunity Index pulls data for 98% of the United States. So we're constantly in search of comprehensive and representative data sets like that. But what you'll see here, so this table represents Opportunity Index data that's been pulled for all of the UNCG traditional peers based on the county that they reside in. So where you see UNC Greensboro, that data that you're seeing in this table is for Guilford County, pulled from the Opportunity Index. And so these peers have been sorted by opportunity score. So Portland State University, which is in Multnomah County, Oregon, is considered to be a community with the most opportunity out of all of these peers. And at the bottom of the list is University of Memphis, so Shelby County, Tennessee. And so UNCG is, kind of middle of the pack, so to speak. And we also did this analysis with IUPUI's data, but for the sake of time, we're not sharing that one. But it was a stark difference because IUPUI actually ranked second to last out of all of their traditional peers in terms of the demographic and socioeconomic makeup of their community. So to me, that said that IUPUI was very different, that that community was very different than that of all of their traditional peers. Whereas here with UNCG, we see that, it may not be an unreasonable conclusion to make that UNCG's traditional peers are more or less decent community peers as well. And so we started to dig into that more and what could that mean? And so we really link all of this together using that collaboratory data. So that serves as the lens that we can examine the activity, the community university activity that is happening. And what you see here, we pulled out of the Opportunity Index the metric for poverty specifically. So this is part of the economy dimension, and this is the percent of the population below the poverty line. And we mapped that for all of UNCG's traditionally identified peers. And you'll see, so here, Florida Atlantic, 13% of the population live below the poverty line, whereas in Northern Arizona, that number is 22%. So there's a decent spread there. And we can use this data to really demonstrate how UNCG is directly aligning their institutional resources. So you'll see here again, UNCG is like middle of the pack per se. But if you look at UNCG's Collaboratory, and it's publicly available, so that you could go search this. I can stick the link in the chat in a minute. But if you search UNCG's Collaboratory for activities that address poverty, you'll see very quickly how faculty, staff, and students are working in that area. So here there are 13 activities, 65 community organizations, 11 courses that are connected to activities that address poverty, 19 units across the campus, and 10 faculty and staff across disciplines who are working in that area. So if we are able to say, hey, our community, like let's say we were Northern Arizona and we knew that almost a quarter of our population was living in poverty, as an institution, we could not only make the claim, but also provide direct evidence that says, this is how our institution is working to move the needle to bring that number down and to raise more people up out of poverty. And so beyond a single institution, we can begin to look at this data across institutions. So what you're looking at here, we ran a partnership initiative with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And so that we had 24 institutions that participated at a part of that, and they're just now concluding a year-long community of practice cohort, if you will, where they're working to roll Collaboratory out on their campuses. And so while they're still in that rollout process, we're already able to start learning some interesting things about their campuses and the work that's happening. And so here, you'll see the red bars that represent the percent of the population that is below the poverty line for each of those communities. And the blue bar is activities in their Collaboratory Portal that address poverty. So you can begin to see, like over here, whatever this de-identified institution 3 is, 12% of their activities are addressing, 12% of their population is below the poverty line, and half of their activities address poverty. Whereas over here, whatever institution 17 is, 17% of their population is living below the poverty line, and 12% of all of their activities address poverty that their institution is doing in and with their community. So as we work to get more data, and as we can pivot this on IPEDS data, so we can look at urban serving institutions, we can look at land grants, small, medium, large. I mean, if it's in IPEDS, we can pivot on that data and really begin to break it down and try to understand a little bit more. So for the sake of time, I will move on, but I will leave you with a concept paper. So we had to fly through this model that we've been thinking about for a year in about 10 minutes. But if you want to learn more, we just published last week, actually, a paper that's available online that you can download and reference. And then hopefully next month, we'll be launching our open data set in Civic Leads. So if you are interested in learning about that and how you can leverage the data, please don't hesitate to reach out. And Kristin Norris, I think I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. I think my internet is better now. That was the nightmare. Sorry, I got pumped out, and I appreciate for you just picking up and going with it. It literally kicked me out of Zoom for a second. I wanted to make sure we had time for dialogue. There were questions about the functionality of Collaboratory, but also any questions that you just have about how we can use it to better understand our partnership. So feel free to jump in. I think there were some stuff that we didn't answer, any of your questions that you put into the Q&A or in the chat. Also, please let me know. We can touch.
Can I ask you a verbal question?
Yes, please do.
I think it's very nice to be able to have a way to measure your activities and to have a uniform way to do that. But one of the things I think everyone needs to keep in mind, and this comes to me through my past experience. I was a state legislator before I started working in higher education. And, you know, as a legislator, most of your work is done in committee. And I will tell you that every single year in one of my committees, there would be a bill in which, you know, all the experts are there and all the people that, you know, they come in and we think everything's being worked out. But you'd have a public hearing and a citizen would get up and bring up an issue that not a single person had thought about before. And everybody realizes that what the citizen is bringing up is a valid point and has to be addressed. So I want you all to keep in mind that when you're dealing with the community around your colleges, you need to make sure that you're not just talking with different organizations and different groups, but you're allowing a process to have an open hearing to hear from citizens about things that you may not have thought about.
I agree, Bob, and I think was one of my discoveries in my process of implementing Collaboratory, because we only asked faculty to tell us who their community partners were, as if there was an organization, you know, or that it was never about what neighborhood association or what community hearings or town, not to say their institutions don't host town halls, and I would say Ellen's process is probably the best example of an IU campus that intentionally facilitates ongoing meaningful dialogue around specific issues and subjects for one of the IU campuses. I just think that there's oftentimes you can show up at those meetings, Bob, and no one actually knows that the people in the room are actually doing stuff already. They're just, and so it becomes everybody knows what everyone, you only know what you're doing, and you may know what the person next to you is doing, but when the fact that those people are never speaking to each other, and it's like, the Rolodex is in your head. And I feel like Collaboratory becomes the public Rolodex through which we can better start to have a conversation. That's, I don't know, Ellen, I think you've had the most experience in listening to communities standing up in these moments too, though.
Yeah, I would agree, Bob, and this is a long-standing issue that we've had, in the university community environment where, and that was one of the reasons why we moved forward with our community conversations, not only in person with focus groups, but then post-COVID, we moved it to an online environment. But, one of the complaints that we constantly get is that, or we hear about, is that, you're not doing enough, quote, in the community, right? But to a large extent, it goes back to Kristin's point, which is it's very difficult to know everything that's happening. And so Collaboratory does provide us that opportunity to start to collect that information and tell those stories in a lot of different ways, depending on your community context. So whether or not we can have those conversations with legislators, or they can go out to our resource, in YouTube and learn about the things that are happening, will, I think, advance that conversation, and then hopefully lead eventually to a lower barriers to having those conversations too. So. And finally, ensuring that the community actually has a voice in that process.
Yeah, I think that was one of the downsides, or sort of, the tool can't be a silver bullet, right? And Kristin and Emily can speak to the initial development of it. There are some tools out there or processes that will automatically survey or include your community partners and ask them to create a profile or ask them to log in and say, and to contribute to it. Collaboratory does not have community partners contributing their activities. You have to have a university login. You can see all of those activities that are represented for your community organization, but not necessarily add to them without contacting the administrator to let us know. And there's some downsides to that, right? That we aren't using this as a tool to foster a dialogue and ongoing conversation in some ways. UNCG could set up a call center for people to request information or to give feedback as a way, but also like, here's what we know what we're doing. My experience has been that in our community partners that we work with and our community members that we work with, most of our community members don't know what the university is currently doing. And of our community partners, they don't know what everyone's doing. The one person that, like if I think about large organizations that are next to my institution, our public school system, well, the dean of the School of Education has a really good relationship with the superintendent for Indianapolis Public Schools. But the person in the superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools is not aware of the 30 things that IUPUI is doing with all of the schools in the district. And it becomes a more difficult conversation for the dean of the School of Education and the superintendent to really talk about how they're working together to address K-12 outcomes if we weren't really all aware of what was already in existence. And we've discovered this time and time again, the utility of this for both our community partners and for our faculty and our administrators on campus to help think about their partnerships in more meaningful ways. But I agree, we need to find better ways of talking to our partners, which is why Stephen's, those of you who are on the June call, Stephen's Okta model was fantastic. And Stephen and I both agree that if you were tracking your partnerships in Collaboratory and you leveraged Okta, you would have really fantastic feedback and understanding of your partnerships in relation to others. It'd be like the perfect combination of things. I was curious to any other questions that you have, but also just how are you guys tracking right now? Are you guys all doing this currently on your own, like in an Excel spreadsheet? What are you doing? How do you currently track your partnerships?
This is Preeti from Stanford, and that's what we are doing. We have a massive Google Doc and individually sourcing it, and it gets really messy really fast.
And Preeti, if you have a spreadsheet, are you able, if I were to ask you, what are you doing to address poverty right now? Could you answer that fairly quickly and robustly?
Yes and no. So it's tied. Our university president has 4 primary areas of work. And so we have it clustered under those 4 categories, but not like we look at affordability. I couldn't tell you in the way that you say poverty. I thought what was striking, one of the things we're wrestling with, and I know correlation isn't causation, but I wonder if over time, one of the tools that Collaboratory is looking toward is as the number of individual efforts the university is doing related to poverty, can you in some way make an argument that the number of those efforts led by the university or co-created are having a meaningful impact on reducing poverty in the region, right? I think that's what we're all trying to get at in some way. And I wonder what kind of tools you all are thinking about as you're trying to track that piece, because having the data is such an important part, but telling the story, I think, was another big theme of today's conversation.
Yes. Go ahead, Kristin. I'll let you answer. Some of that's opportunity index stuff, but like those numbers don't mean that.
Well, so one of the things we did at UNCG is Collaboratory gives you a source pool of people, of information. So if you know that there are 13 programs across the institution in 7 departments addressing literacy, and you know the primary contact for each of those, you know, Collaboratory is not going to tell you whether the needle is being moved or not, but it gives you the contact information that you need to go follow up with each of those program coordinators or primary contacts and say, hey, what metrics are you tracking? Like, how can we begin to tell a collective story? Is there a common metric we could embed to talk about, you know, pre-post? If you're doing a mentoring or a literacy initiative, can you do a pre-post with the students that you're working with so that we can aggregate that data up across these programs that typically never talk to one another, that have no idea that they're working in the same schools or with the same student populations? So I think the ability to convene and connect disparate initiatives and go back and work smarter and not harder within those to like layer on evaluation projects in systematic ways is where you're going to begin to see some of that, you know, causation that you're looking for, because you can talk about the impacts of all of those programs at a high level if you know where they're happening.
And I would also offer that thinking about outputs and outcomes. So outputs being like, this is the number of students that we have involved in these kinds of organizations. Those are that you can describe that, you know, they showed up and that there's, you know, that there were classes, and you can get those kinds of numbers. When we're looking at outcomes, so like, you know, what happened? You know, did we reduce poverty? Did we increase financial literacy? Did we increase graduation rates or self-efficacy, whatever those might be? We've talked about Collaboratory as providing breadcrumbs. So how can you go back and find that data? Again, through that systematic collection of information. So I think it really depends on who your audience is. I talked a little bit about the importance of finding meaningful data for your audience. And I know that Bob Hull spoke about being a legislator, and I've heard folks say both the story gets you in the door, the data gets you the thing you ask for. I've heard it opposite, right? The data gets you in the door, but the story is the thing that like really clutches the heart and gets the yes. And so I do think that knowing who your audience is going to be the most important and what they care about. Because if it's a mismatch, if you're throwing all these numbers and they're like, I can't tell if that's a big number, like is 3 million a lot for Palo Alto? Like, I don't know, you know, that could be a big number for Greensboro. So I think that context, but then there are other people who they say, don't tell me that information, please give me a story. And that's where Collaboratory helps us find the people that we can quickly identify whether they would have the story or the kind of story that we're looking for. So I find that this is also helpful for our advancement and development folks and capital campaign, because they're often looking for faculty who can go with them or who they can tell that story when they say, well, you know, have you heard about so-and-so's research? Collaboratory gives them that information to be able to even identify whether they want to talk to them next.
I hate to end this conversation, but we're over time and we've had people leave us. I love the fact that everyone has been very much engaged. I wanted to make an announcement on, first of all, I wanted to thank our panelists today. I know that Bob is still there. Bob, thank you for your very applicable comment. I really appreciate the panelists today. Thank you so much for putting this together. This has been phenomenal. We really learned a lot today. And I just wanted to mention that August the 25th, networking is back for the Town Gown Turnaround. September the 29th, Stephen is going to be doing the ITGA. I was hoping that Poppy was going to be able to stay on, but she left. But Poppy, they're having the UK forum tomorrow. If anybody is interested in attending that, I can send more information. I also send it out through the listserv. And then this recording should be available live by Friday. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Beth.
Bye.
Thank you.